So in the next phase of our work, we started looking at the energetic communication between people. And I won't go into all the history of how this got started. It was kind of a fun, almost accident experiment that we were doing. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about it. We were actually doing some research with water and water storing informational patterns and so on, and got onto an accidental finding about water amplifying magnetic fields to an experimental setup we had. And at that time, Professor William Tiller, was working in our lab for a few years after he retired from Stanford, and we were doing this work together. And then he ended up doing all the mathematical models of how, because water wasn't supposed to do this, right? He said impossible. I'm probably going into way too much detail here, but it was a little fun adventure because he had worked out the math and spent about a year doing it, and finally explained how water was indeed amplifying weak electromagnetic signals. And then we verified that. But then, so we got the idea, well, if we put an electrode in a glass of water, it should be an amplifier for these subtle energetic signals. And sure enough, it worked. We could actually measure a person's heartbeat in a glass of water, non-locally, or not, when you're in the field environment. And it was really kind of embarrassing to look back on that, because the next thing was, well, wait a minute, we're water. We're 80% water, depending upon how you look at it, or 90% in some ways. So our systems are these giant amplifiers of these subtle, weak magnetic signals. And so we kind of came into it backwards in a certain way, if you get my drift there. Anyway, that was kind of the revelation. So then that started a whole new line of research that unfolded in some amazingly simple experiments that were able to quite quickly and easily prove that we are communicating through these magnetic or energetic fields between people. So to help the listeners understand that, every time the heart beats, we radiate a magnetic field. So when this is basic physics, and when you go to the doctor's office and they put the electrodes across your chest to measure your electrocardiogram, or electrodes on your head to measure brain waves, the EEGs, what you're measuring there is the flow of current. Right? So when we put electrodes across the chest, the electricity, that's why it's called the electrocardiogram, the electricity produced by the heart is many, many times greater than the electricity produced by the brain. It's huge. It's, millivolts versus microvolts kind of level. So that whenever there's a flow of current, now this is as basic physics as you can get, whenever there's a flow of current, you create a magnetic field. Okay, this is the basis of all communication in our modern world, this link between electrical fields and magnetic fields, or electricity and magnetism. Now, the electric fields and magnetic fields are two very different things. People tend not to think of it that way because we kind of bundle it together into electromagnetism, but they're very different types of fields. So anyway, one of the qualities of a magnetic field is they penetrate through things. So a great example of this, which ties back into my early years at Motorola as a communications engineer, we do this every day. Almost everybody has a cell phone. Well, how is it that the signal gets from the phone to the cell tower? Well, we're using the electromagnetic field as the carrier of the information, and the information in the case of our cell phone is our voice, or the text message, or the photo we're sending. We're just using the electromagnetic field to get it from point A to point B, riding on top of that, right? Well, why does it work inside of buildings? So, right, it's the magnetic component that penetrates through the windows and the walls, and so in the human body, it's the same way. The magnetic field easily radiates outside the body. And with today's equipment, devices called magnetometers, it's different, you can't measure them with electrodes. You can measure the cardiac field produced by the heart, the literal magnetic field. It's exactly the same kind of magnetic field that the cell phone uses, right? About 3 feet away. Now, with the same instrument, we can measure a brainwave about an inch away. So you get the difference in the size of these fields. So that's something we can measure here in the lab, right, with a magnetometer. And so the next step, which was also quite easy in hindsight, just nobody ever thought to do it before. In fact, using the same type of techniques that I would have used back in Motorola days to look at the signal being carried by the carrier wave in a radio or something, right, called spectral analysis, we were able to quite easily see that the field of the heart is carrying information about our emotional state. So now today, with about 75% accuracy, we can measure the magnetic fields and tell what somebody's feeling. by just looking at the information being carried by the fields. Okay, so that actually wasn't that hard to do. In fact, when we first did this, I did a lot of literature searching to say somebody else has had to have done this, right? Nobody had ever published anything even remotely like this. Nobody had thought to look at it like this. So then the next step in that progression was, okay, we know we're radiating the signals. We can measure them, right? We know that the information being carried is changing based on our emotional state. Probably much more is being carried, but that's the one thing we know for sure. Well, what about other people? Are there nervous systems like big antennas, just like the cell tower, that receives the signal? And that actually was a fairly easy step as well, to show that, yes, in fact, our nervous systems are exquisitely tuned, if you will, to other biologically generated fields. Kind of like little windows. Our bodies know what signals that it's appropriate to receive and what ones to reject. And it just, in hindsight, kind of makes common sense that it would be the ones that the body is generating and using that we'd be sensitive to. So we now know that the fields we radiate, our heart's field, can have measurable effects on other people, that our nervous systems detect these fields, but also have measurable biological and physiological effects. So, for example, one study, there's a number of them now, but my favorite one of the first ones, had people sitting around a table. They're all wired up, measuring their physiology, their heart rhythms especially. And when some of the people would get into a coherent heart rhythm state, that had a measurable effect on lifting the other people into a more coherent state. Not everyone every time, but across the study as a whole, it was a highly significant effect. So this really is a way of, well, the study proved that what we're feeding the field, what we're radiating, matters. It has measurable impact on others around us. Well, of course, this works both ways, right? There's always, what I'm saying, this energetic communication is always going on between people or groups of people. Whether we know it or not, whether you believe me or not, it's still occurring. And it's not just that you can lift someone when you're in a coherent state. And I think most people know this from just life. If somebody comes in, you're having a nice time in your living room or a party or whatever, and somebody comes in who's really upset. The traffic was horrible, or they just, and they're upset and they want you to know it and want you to feel that way too. I mean, how that can really bring down, if you will, the vibration of an otherwise nice encounter. But most people that ever worked in businesses and things know this. Or if you have to deal with a customer who's not happy and is really upset, there's something beyond, especially if it's person to person, you can feel that. And it's also common in our language, right? So again, I think most people, we've always had intuitive understandings of this stuff, that it comes into our language without us really thinking about it. So I grew up with a statement that I would hear all the time. God, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, right? Or the tension in the air and these types of things. Or, then through the late 60s and 70s, we started talking about vibes, right? Boy, you could just feel the vibes in the room. But these were really people's kind of intuitive understandings of a real thing. It's just now we're able to bring science to it and prove that these things really are going on and have real effects. So for example, one of the things we teach in our training programs, why this is important, there's many, but if you understand that there's this energetic communication going on, and if you think back about this, you probably experienced it. You might be in a situation where somebody's got a smile on their face, but they're saying something positive or whatever, and they're saying something, but you're feeling that what they're saying doesn't match something. There's a mismatch. Well, as it turns out, for most people, it's that energetic perception that wins the story, right? So if there's a mismatch between, maybe I'm feeling frustrated or upset. It could have been a phone call I got before I'm interacting with a person, right? Even though I'm saying something like maybe giving them a compliment, if I've still got that anxiety or that frustration going on, that's the energetic field that they're feeling and experiencing from me. So it creates that mismatch, right? So they walk away at best confused. And in my own life even, I've been in that situation on both sides of that, but where I really was sincere about what I was saying, but they were left with the feeling. right? So it can create a lot of stress and problems in relationships when this mismatch is going on. I mean, there are situations where you might be in a more coherent state yourself, and you interact with somebody who's not in such a nice state. Maybe they're a little irritated or frustrated or anxious or whatever. Then you have a kind of two field environments coming together, and really the key here is you can either get pulled into the downward state very easily, and that's kind of what sympathy is, if you will, when which doesn't help anybody. But if you're able, and this is really what a lot of the heart math programs are all about, is how do we maintain our sense of coherence in our center, even in that situation? And it takes some practice, but you can certainly do that. Now we're creating a field environment that sustains its coherence. And that creates what we call our personal field environment that's more coherent. So now the person coming into that field environment, if we're able to sustain that, it has a chance to help them lift and regain their center and their composure. Doesn't guarantee it, because we still have choice. If we're really pissed off and want to stay that way, well, that's their choice. But at least we're creating a field environment where that may not be that comfortable for as long, because they'll start feeling a bit of a mismatch, right, there as well. So a lot of what heart math is really about is really being able to maintain our heart center, our composure, if you will, and our emotional balance in a chaotic world. We're certainly not saying that you're going to get into these coherent states and be self-regulated. It's going to change the external world, that stress never happens in our life again. Of course not. But what we can control, what we can regulate, is how we perceive and how we react to the external world. And aligning with that deeper heart's intelligence is just a really effective way to be able to do that, because it's oftentimes the mind can't do it by itself. It really needs the rhythms of the heart to come into that coherent alignment, and also that accesses that intuitive information. So it gives us an out-of-the-box kind of way of thinking and seeing and understanding what's going on. That can lift us above the normal reactions and automated reaction patterns that we have.